Hello everyone. My name is Rose, and I am the president of Project NOR, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you all so much for coming. We are so grateful that you've come here tonight, especially to learn about the crisis in Syria, as well as the donations you've given that will be going directly to Syrian refugees to the UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to explain who we are as a club and why we decided to do a fundraiser for Syria. Project NOR is an interfaith, inter-ethnic club that focuses on the Middle East and the Muslim world. In this past year, we put on educational and charitable events on topics ranging from the Egyptian Revolution to sponsoring an interfaith hand drive that we worked with our local Islamic, Christian, and Jewish communities. This fundraising event is a new direction for us and was inspired and motivated by my trip to Lebanon last summer. It was actually a vacation that I went on with my family, but while I was there, I saw an unusual number of homeless people living on the street begging for money in almost 100-degree weather. I asked my friend why there were so many of these people on the street, because a lot of them were actually young families with children, as well as old women in full black in 100-degree weather. And she said they were not Lebanese, but actually Syrian refugees who had fled the war. Since that August that I was in Lebanon, the number of refugees has increased dramatically. There is now an estimated 10,000 Syrian refugees outside the country, 7,000 of which are in Turkey right now. If they are able to escape and cross the border, they are usually searched by Turkish soldiers or Lebanese soldiers, and they are moved into refugee camps. These ones are actually sponsored by the Turkish government. The Syrian uprising began last spring, joining in the Arab Spring movement, seeking the resignation of the president, Bashar al-Assad, and also seeking democratic reform. Since then, an estimated 13,000 to 17,000 people have been killed. Today, Assad's government appears to be holding strong, despite the rising protests, evidenced by our attempts to find activists in Syria who will learn to Skype into this particular event. Every person that we tried to talk to was worried about the government finding them and had potential government repercussions. And one activist, a Christian Syrian living in Aleppo, described a scene of barely controlled chaos in Syria right now. He said that in this recent January of 2012, the country experienced a serious economic crisis with horrifically inflated gas and bread prices. Schools weren't able to keep their classrooms, some areas lost electricity for a week, and families had difficulty feeding their children. Then, 2 months later, with almost no warning, the government stepped in. Gas prices were back to normal the next morning, electricity came back on, and even the bakeries brought their bread prices back down to normal overnight. But so back to tonight. So as our club grew this past year, we decided that we wanted to do a fundraiser to benefit an international community. Although we initially tossed some ideas around, the more we read the news and the more we discussed amongst ourselves, Syria became the obvious choice for us to put funds towards. So along with tonight's dinner, next Thursday, which is the 31st, at around lunchtime, 11 to 2, on the SLD lawn across there, we will be selling the same delicious foods you guys have enjoyed tonight for $5 a plate. 100% of the proceeds will go to the UNHCR for Syrian refugees. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panelists for tonight. First, we have Majid Rafizadeh. Majid is an Iranian Syrian scholar, human rights activist, and columnist for the Harvard International Review. He completed his Fulbright teaching scholarship in the U.S., where he taught religious studies in the Religious Studies Department here at UCSD. He has previously taught at several other universities, including Damascus University, and he is a frequent media commentator speaking on programs such as CNN, BBC Persian, and Al Jazeera, speaking both in English, Farsi, and Arabic. And then we have Professor Walid Afifi, who is born in Lebanon and raised in Lebanon of Muslim descent. He is a professor in the Communications Department and is chair of the Middle Eastern Studies Department. He received his PhD from the University of Arizona, and his current emphasis is on uncertainty and informational management. Professor Wang Campo received his PhD at the University of Chicago and is Associate Professor of Religious Studies with an emphasis on history of religion, particularly in Islam and Arabic. And he is very involved in the UC Education Abroad program. And then finally, Stephen Humphreys is a professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern history. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan and has lived and traveled throughout the Middle East to expand his studies. All right, thanks.
thank you first. Thank you all for coming to me today. I want to thank Dr. Rose and Sean for organizing Principal actually for either organizing or for helping the Syrian refugees. I'm honored to be Dr. Khan's office and I think to talk about Syria. And I think I will defer the most important things to their expertise. And since I've been approached by many people who like to contribute to the change in Syria or interested in the politics of the Middle East and by different people have been asking questions related to the civil war, the process of civil war, or the practicality of foreign intervention in Syria. I thought today I might change the focus a little bit and share with you my personal experience growing up in Syria and hope that will shed light on the bigger picture I'm moving forward. First, I want to make it clear that I'm, as she wrote there, I'm Syrian Iranian. I grew up both in Syria and Iran. I remember when I came to the United States in 2009, there was a kind police officer at the airport, Washington, D.C., and he told me, "You're Syrian?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You just see the North Korean wife, then you will have the three axes of evil at the same place." The essence of evil. So I grew up in Damascus, and I remember when I was in high school. Can I have this? Yeah, thank you. This is the neighborhood I grew up at. My brother came last week from Damascus. It's a working class neighborhood. And in high school, when we wanted to talk about politics, I remember that we had to take turns in each other's homes and lock the door, be careful that nobody is there overhear us, and even use codes. For instance, I remember for back party we used hummus or bashar, we used falafel, so if anybody heard us, they wouldn't know what we were talking about. I'm not going to go through all the codes. They might be using them now. And one day after one of these meetings, we were walking down the street and there was a new photo of Bashar at that time. And I told them his father is ready to pass power to him. He's ready to pass power to and then I was immediately approached by two people who were wearing my shirt, plainclothes shirt, and they said, "Why did you come to the photo of the son of the president?" And I was in high school, so I told them, I didn't know it was illegal to come to a photo, and I think, by the way, he had a nice smile in the photo. And then they said, "Well, it seems like your parents haven't taught you to shut up when they talk with the mukhabarat." And mukhabarat is the security forces. And, well, taken to the police station, I won't bore you with the details. And what we're doing today here, talking, discussing, debating, sitting around each other, was a dream. And I think it's a dream for all Syrian people. And in my opinion, I think the number one reason that the Syrians have taken to the street is to achieve the basic fundamental human rights that American Declaration of Independence calls inalienable rights. I think these are universal rights that endowed in us by virtue of being human. And I think what the people want is just to be treated as human, not to be treated as objects, and not to be subjugated or dehumanized or humiliated. And in my opinion, this is the number one reason. And the recent poll has shown actually across the Arab world when they asked the young people, "Why do you go to the street and risk your life? Why do you brave the bullet?" And they said dignity. Dignity was number one. And of course there was economic prosperity, there was social integration, and there were political authoritarianism, and there were different reasons, but dignity was number one. And the second thing that I would like to talk about is the people who sparked the revolution. Throughout the history, there are people who have made real changes. I mean, in the United States, we had in 1953 Rosa Parks, who refused to move up from the street, and she stood up for her rights. In Tunisia, you know, we had Mohammed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire. And in Egypt, we have Khalid Said. And in Syria, I was thinking, who is the person who sparked the revolution? There is no doubt that there is underlying deep structural grievances that all people share, but there is somebody who sparked the revolution. And I realized that they were children. In Syria, not adults, there were children who, after school, they wrote anti-governmental graffiti learned from Egypt, and they were arrested, tortured, and when their parents went to the police station, basically the police officers told them, forget you had these children. And they begged them, they apologized, and the police officer said, go make new ones, or if your wife can't make new children, bring her here, we know how to make her children. And I think children has been a target of these regimes. UNICEF has said that so far more than 500 children here have been tortured and killed, and this is very tragic. And this reminds me of the personal story that I usually call my family to ask them about their health, you know, the reason for my trip. And 3 weeks ago when I called them, they told me there was an explosion in Rafizadeh, and it was next to the building that my brother lives. And he had 2 children, Rasul and Reza, a girl and a boy. And the strength of the explosion shattered the window, and the children were like always sleeping in the kitchen and not to eat more food while their father is walking outside. And but they were caught by the windows, their face, their hands, and the roof of the kitchen came down. But fortunately, they were taken to the hospital and they were treated. And when I talked to them, I talked to the 2, if you want to see their photos later. This is the daughter, this is the boy. They're not very clear. I didn't have any other photos, sorry. So I talked to Batul. She's actually now 3 years older than this daughter, and she said she sometimes tells me things that she's not necessarily tell her parents, or she's shocked to tell me, so she's told me. Can I tell you something Uncle Majid? I said yes. She said that I heard in school the children overheard the children saying like, no boy will marry me because I have come from my state in the military in school. And I told her, well, I think you're the smartest, the most beautiful, the greatest here. Tomorrow you're a hero in the society. And then she told me, you told me I'm the most beautiful. Am I more beautiful than the American girls up there? Yeah, she has been told to so what I want to say here is that as individual human beings we can acknowledge what is going there. But when I actually hang up the phone, I remembered Hamza Khatib, if you know him. Hamza Khatib. And when I remembered him, I was very grateful that they survived. My niece and nephew survived. If you know Hamza Khatib, it's written, Hamza Khatib, we are all Hamza Khatib. Hamza Khatib was a 13-year-old boy who was arrested by the security forces, and he was tortured hideously and brutally. They turned up cigarettes in his body, they dislocated his hand, they shot him. When his body was returned to his family, it was horrible. They returned the body in this plastic back to his parents, so they weren't there to come to the street anymore. I think, as I said, we can acknowledge what is going there, but I think we should take one step further and contribute to the change in Syria and actually be a shaper, a person who shape. We don't have to be human to contribute to the change there. And I think this is, I will finally just quote, I finally will quote Martin Luther King, who said, injustice anywhere would lead to justice everywhere.
Malik has, I think, the unique advantage in these hard times of having family and direct contacts and so on in Syria, and can speak about the contemporary state of the country in a way that obviously I cannot. I was last in Syria in 2004, early in the first term of Bashar al-Assad as president of the country. And I might start just with a couple of very brief impressions from that trip. The first thing to tell you is that Syria, even under a dictatorship, was, I think at bottom still is, an extraordinary country that's full of marvelous things that are not to be seen anywhere else in the world, and also full of very courteous, extraordinarily really courteous and hospitable people. It takes longer to get through greetings in Syria than it does in any other Arab country, because they sort of have very elaborate, rather florid things. You have to do 3 or 4 before you're finished and get on to business. So that's one of the charms of the country. A couple of things that were charming were a couple of political symbols, and they make an interesting contrast. Politics was a subject we were told immediately by our driver that we just don't say anything, and we knew anyway not to say anything, so that was easy. But you could look, and you could see a couple of things. And one of them was over a number of public buildings, especially in schools, very faded, almost eradicated slogans from the early Ba'athist period, around 30 years ago. The slogan of the Ba'ath Party was one nation with an eternal mission. And the nation referred to the Arab nation as a whole. And I have to say that although the slogan was painted everywhere when it was fresh and all over the place, the Ba'ath Party never came within 1,000 miles of it, but it was there. But now almost faded out. And what you saw instead was something that I said to myself and under my breath, and especially when I got back to the, what did we say, freedom-loving Jordan, was the Holy Trinity. It was a kind of a triple picture. Assad Père, Hafiz al-Assad, the founder of, I think we can say the current dynasty, his older son, Basil, who was killed in an accident, but who had been clearly intended as heir apparent, and then Bashar, the ophthalmologist, with the British-born wife from the family of Humps, I think a Sunni family of Humps, who actually got the job. So you had the 3 faces sort of woven together, and you found them everywhere. And they were on shop windows, they were in transparencies, on car windows, just everywhere you looked. So the old idealizing slogan had been replaced by what was clearly a cult of personality, and we have to say a kind of a cult of dynastic personality, and in some ways that tells you a lot about what you need to know about the history of Syria over recent decades. I found this afternoon in gathering materials a very interesting brief statement from Joshua Landis, who's the new president of the Syrian Studies Association, and who has run a very good blog on Syria. He's at the University of Oklahoma. And the comments are interesting enough that I thought it would be worth reading to you, because I think it also says a lot about how we are to situate Syria within the historical context of the Arab countries in particular, the Middle East more generally, in recent decades. So he says the Assad stands atop the last minoritarian regime in the Levant and does seem destined to fall in this age of popular revolt. And when they do, the post-colonial era will draw to a close. In many respects, the Middle East has been defined by minoritarian regimes. Following World War II, minorities took control in every Levant state, that's the Eastern Mediterranean, thanks to the colonial powers and their divide and rule tactics, and to the fragmented national communities that bedeviled the region. The Maronites in Lebanon, the Sunnis in Iraq, and the Alawis in Syria were able to capture the state due to the leg up they were given by the French and the British. The Alawis captured power in Syria in 1966 due to their over-recruitment in the military by the French Mandate authorities. Alawis, by the mid-1950s, constituted some 65%, two-thirds, of the non-commissioned officers in the Syrian military. Within a decade, they took control of the military leadership and was at Syria itself. The Alawis in Syria seem determined to repeat the violent plunge to the bottom that has characterized the stubborn determination of minorities to cling to power elsewhere in the region. It is hard to determine whether this stubbornness is due to the rapaciousness of a corrupt elite, to the bleak prospects that the Alawi community faces in a post-Assad Syria, or to the weak faith that many in the region place in democracy and power-sharing formulas. Whatever the reason, Syria's transition away from minority rule is likely to be lengthy and violent. This seems to be the pattern of the region where politics is viewed by so many as a zero-sum game. Hopefully, the end of Syria's minoritarian regime will not be as protracted or as bloody as it has been elsewhere in the region, but clearly the military has a lot of fight left in it. When the Assad regime does fall, however, he assumes that it will, I reserve judgment. When the Assad regime does fall, however, it will be the end of a post-colonial era in the Levant, during which religious minorities held the lion's share of power. So I think maybe a place to start with Syria is precisely just with the religious demography. Syria is a fairly complicated place. It's predominantly Arab, but it has significant Turkish and Kurdish and Armenian minorities as well. Fundamentally, politics in Syria has not really broken down over ethnic lines. The Kurds are a little restive, I suppose, and I hope I won't cause any trouble by saying, when are they not? But it's not been a huge problem there. It's really the religious sectarian divisions that have been more critical elements. So Sunni Muslims, the kind of broad mainstream branch of Islam, are about 75% of the population. Christians make up about 10%. Christians of many different sorts, most of them historically not on speaking terms with one another, but being a minority maybe helps them get past that bit. There are a couple of very small groups, sort of offshoots of Shiite Islam, the Druze and some other Shiite groups, and they're about 5% of the population collectively. The group called the Alawis, or more strictly and accurately, Nusayris, make up 11 or 12% of the population. And historically, they lived in the mountains along the northern, there's only one coast, the northern coast along the Mediterranean and Syria. And they were historically among the poorest, the most isolated, and the group guarded with the gravest, deepest contempt by everybody else around them. The Alawis were the bottom. They were the pond scum of the Syrian population. And what has happened since the 1950s and 1960s is that the Alawis have risen to the top and have come to constitute the power elite in Syria. And you can ask how this happened, and it's always good to blame everything on the colonial period and colonial authorities. And That's not quite fair, but in this case it's not totally unfair either. The French occupied what was supposed to be an independent or quasi-independent Syria in 1920, right after World War I. And one of the things the French liked to do, one of the things that all colonial powers like to do, was to keep things very economical, which means that you don't maintain large garrisons and large military formations and so on in the country. You get locals to do the police and security work for you. And the French, not entirely differently from the British, had the very sound idea, it is a sound idea, that the people you recruit to do this sort of policing and security work are going to be minority groups, because they're the ones who are going to owe you a favor. I mean, you're the ones who can protect them from the majority. You're the ones who can get a leg up by working with the colonial authorities and so on. And the Syrians, the French authorities during the 25 years or so that they were in charge focused on hiring Alawites from the mountains in northern Syria for their gendarmerie and the very tiny Syrian army that they constituted. The Syrian army at independence in 1946 was, I think, 7,500, with a half dozen tanks or something like this. It's not a really big army. The Alawites, as the quotation from Landis suggested, were heavily overrepresented in the army. I mean, for them, the army was a way up. Bad pay and bad treatment is still better than what they had had before. And Hafiz al-Assad himself entered the Air Force Academy, I think it must have been around 1948 or 49, 1950, something like that. Became an Air Force officer. And that's one element, that the Alawites became an important element in the army, really possibly the most important element in the army. And in a region where military tended to dominate politics very, very strongly in the 50s and 60s, obviously that gave them kind of a leg up in the competition for power in Syria anyway. That was linked to the attraction they felt to a pan-Arab nationalist party called the Ba'ath, the Resurrection or Renaissance Party. It has a lot of names. That had been founded in 1943 by a Sunni pharmacist and a Christian school teacher who, when the Ba'ath Party really got influential, were completely kicked aside. This happens all the time. But the Ba'ath really found a good recruiting ground in the Syrian army, and the Syrian army being dominated by Alawites meant that the Alawites were going to, again, have a political base to play from as well as their military base. The Ba'ath Party staged more than several coups actually in the course of the 1960s. Syria was the classic tumbling act. And that went on until the catastrophe of June 1967, when all Arab regimes were totally and rightfully humiliated by their abysmal performance in the June War. None of them actually went away, which is the funny thing. I mean, Nasser stayed in power. The Alawites, or the Ba'athists/Alawites, stayed in power in Syria, but not the same people. This rather obscure Air Force Brigadier General Hafiz al-Assad elbowed his colleagues aside, and by 1968 he was the power behind the scenes. In 1970 he took power directly and instituted, after the incredible tumbling act of Syrian politics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, he instituted one of the longest-lived, most durable governments in the Middle East. We cannot say that he was a nice guy, but he knew how to stay in power. And he turned the Ba'ath, and he built really quite an extraordinary security apparatus. My own sense was, when he died, that the system might fall apart because that's kind of a personal achievement. I mean, he was the spider at the center of the web, and everything else was connected to him. But in fact, he obviously was a good institution builder, because the party apparatus and the security apparatus and all of this stuff was able to continue on without losing the beat. So they invited, well, this before Hafiz died, but Bashar was invited to come back from London and sort of be the heir apparent, the prince in waiting. And on his father's death, he succeeded, I think we can say, to the throne. He succeeded to the presidential palace. People didn't think he would last a month. However, he's done it, and with whomever, he has been there ever since. The last thing I think I would really want to say, so that others will have very different contributions to make, is simply to look at the people who are in charge in Syria. And I think I can say, and I don't think this is an exaggeration or a distortion, it's a mafia family. Everybody is related to everybody else. Two-thirds, three-quarters of the elite are Alawis. They are connected in very complex ways by marriage and blood kinship. There are a minority, but a significant minority of Sunnis as well, who will hold some sensitive positions. And the fact that they're Sunnis gives the regime some connection with the majority religious population in the country, but there aren't enough Sunnis to run any risk of being able to elbow the Alawis aside or to take over the system. And more to the point, except for the wife of Bashar, who comes from a Sunni family, none of the Sunnis actually in power seem to be married to anybody in the Alawi inner circle. So they're kind of isolated out there. They do not have the marriage and blood kinship ties to play the mafia game. They are, in a sense, rather isolated, and I suspect if need be, they could be disposed of rather easily and replaced by another clone. So I think maybe that's just by way of political background, but one of the things it might suggest when you want to think about the situation is, first of all, that the Bashar regime is really deeply embedded in the political system. It's not a one-man show. By any means. I mean, it's really a very tight network. And the fact that it is a regime that is overwhelmingly dominated by this minority group means that it is a regime, as Landis's remarks suggested, that feels very, very vulnerable to a change, especially in a world in which political Islam, sometimes in very militant forms, is so visible. The Alawis really are going to cling to power through this regime as long as they possibly can, to a very large degree. The Christians, who don't have any reason to love the regime, have found that it's actually been a very good protector of their interests and their security. They're very edgy about seeing the regime overthrown. It's a regime that has a minority base in the population, but it's a substantial majority. It's a good quarter of the population, and it is a regime that really does have control, it seems to me, of all the levers of power, and it's facing an opposition which is very earnest, but an opposition which, so far as I can tell from the outside, and I'm totally from the outside, is very fragmented. And has, beyond getting rid of these people, has not really perhaps come up with the kind of program that would mobilize a broad spectrum of Syria against the regime, except in terms of being able to mobilize people against its sheer brutality, of which we've heard quite a bit, I think, already. So I think those would be my remarks.
I guess I'll speak next. First of all, I want to thank Project Noor and all the students that are involved and leaders in that organization. I really am honored to be here. I'm in great admiration of what you have achieved in just a short period of time. You've existed as a group on this campus. I know that I think you're graduating now, right? You're going to be leaving us. And that's at least Rose and Laura and others that have been involved and instrumental in this organization. And so they're going to leave a big gap that will need to be filled by the next group of students that come through. I strongly encourage you who have come here that aren't seniors yet and aren't graduating to get involved with this organization. It's a very worthwhile organization, despite the fact that I've invited them twice to speak and I was their faculty sponsor. I am their faculty sponsor as well. It's not usual that I in public have to sing for my supper, but as you can tell, I'm sort of doing that. I'll try to stay in tune, following upon the presentations by Majid and Steve. And my subject too deals with the topic of religion, and I think I can provide a different perspective than what Professor Humphreys has given so far. And so first is to ask us to sort of step back a little bit away from the Syrian context and raise the question about the place of religion across the spectrum in the events that are collectively called the Arab Spring. Other terms are used, the Arab uprisings, and the Arab rebirth and things like that in the modern period. And here, we're talking about events that started back in December of 2010, right? And very quickly, by March, we had a change in government in Tunisia and in Egypt, and that was just when the Syrian uprising took off in March. It was relatively late, and a lot of people weren't even, imagining that Syria would be next on the list. Many people said, as Steve has indicated, that the Assad regime is so much in control of the country with their military and security apparatus to the point where they can tell if someone's pointed a picture of Bashar, you're in trouble. I mean, they had an apparatus that infiltrated society on so many levels. Plus, Bashar al-Assad, when he became the president, became promising what came to be called the Damascus Spring. That is a sort of liberalization of the Syrian economy, bringing in the internet, opening more to outside investments, and things like that. And that did occur for a short period of time, but then the security apparatus and repression resumed in the country. But again, I want to sort of raise, take a step back from the Syrian context and raise the question about religion with respect to the Arab Spring and how it manifests itself in different ways in different countries within which it occurred. So if we ask on one extreme, if we ask about what does the spectrum consist of, well, on one extreme is that of Libya, where religion played very little role in providing symbolism or the sort of logic or the organizational structure for the Libyan uprising, which resulted ultimately in the overthrow of Gaddafi. There, I think you had more involved were regional and tribal sort of loyalties that came to the fore, and very little with respect to religion in that case. In Egypt, you're dealing, in contrast to Syria, where you have all those different religious communities that Stephen was indicated, certainly a Sunni majority, but you also have in Syria Shia, in Egypt virtually no Shia, but you do have Christian in Egypt. The basic division of sectarian life is, with respect to the Sunni community in Egypt and the Coptic Christian community in Egypt. And the Coptic Christian community was appealed to by the Mubarak regime, saying that you really need us to protect you from the radical Muslim groups. And generally, for a long time, the Coptic community tended to look to the Mubarak regime as sort of its protector, and turning to it for protection from Islamism, the establishment of Islamic government, and things like that. So the Mubarak regime tended to, hold the loyalty of the Coptic population until its last years, when that loyalty began to erode. Why? Because you had a number of incidents that resulted in the deaths of Copts, the burning of Coptic businesses, the bombings of Coptic churches, where the government did very little to follow through and tracking down the perpetrators of those crimes, punishing them, putting them on trial, or punishing them in any way. So the Coptic community began to raise the question, are they really protecting us? And so even though they were slow to get involved in the anti-Mubarak demonstrations in Tahrir, nonetheless they were there as the opposition began to swell in the first week of the uprising in Egypt. And so we have demonstrations of Copts together with Muslims. Many demonstrators had signs that showed a crescent with a cross together. Ahmed and Ramses, very common Coptic name, our brothers, those kinds of symbolism. Women with hijabs and a woman with a cross standing next to each other. So he had stickers placed on and graffiti on the walls emphasizing how Muslims and Christians were together united against the Mubarak regime. And that seems to still be the case, although there is some tension in the Coptic community as we've seen the rise of Muslim political parties since Mubarak fell. And so there's sort of a tension among the Copts in terms of which direction the country is going. But in terms of the uprising, the Copts were part of it. The Christians were drawn in to the anti-Mubarak demonstration and political action. So we have Libya, where very little religious came to the fore. In Egypt, you have a sectarian element, but it tends to be minimized in terms of the overall cause of removing Mubarak from power. But in the aftermath of the first wave of the Egyptian uprising, what we've seen then is the rise of Islamic political parties, as I pointed out, getting a majority in the parliament. But interestingly, year to year, the parliament has not been very successful in getting an agenda going in Egypt. It's very much divided against itself. With these Islamic parties, they can't unify in terms of what they want to do in the country. So they're losing in the polls. There's just a Gallup poll published, and they're going down. So much for the Islamic threat in Egypt that everybody's been talking about. They can't get their act together. So Islam is not the solution in Egypt, as Egyptians are discovering very quickly. There's a democratic spirit that's come out in Egypt that will not easily be suppressed by any either military government, which is largely what you have now, or an Islamic government. And in that context, I think you can still see a lot of cooperation across religious lines in terms of the developments that occur in that country. On the other extreme, however, you have then the uprising that occurred in Bahrain, where you have a strong sectarian division between a Shi'i minority organized and actively trying to seek just basic civil rights and social justice in Bahrain, let alone religious freedom. And you have then a Sunni minority that controls that government, sort of extending from the Levant to the Gulf in this case, where it was set up by the British, so working by the same playbook, but doing it in the Persian Gulf this time, with a very small Sunni minority controlling a majority Shi'i community. And that sectarian divide was very clear, and was violently, the Copts community, the Shia, were violently suppressed by the Sunni majority government with the help of whom? Saudi Arabia, the neighboring Sunni powerhouse, particularly the Wahhabi Sunni powerhouse, which sent in armored cars and tanks and things like that into Bahrain, just as a friendly gesture towards the Bahraini government. So we have that on one extreme, Libya, the other extreme, Bahrain, in the middle, Egypt, and I also sort of put Tunisia in there as well. So what do we make of the case of Syria? So it's, as Steve indicated, Syria, I should point out, is a country of about 23 million people. So it's larger than Libya in population, larger than Bahrain, smaller than Egypt, but still 23 million people is quite a sizable population. The size of Syria, a political entity that was created less than 100 years ago in the aftermath of the British and French division of the Middle East after World War I. The size of Syria, lesser Syria, I guess we could say, because there's also oftentimes a reference to greater Syria, which includes Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. But lesser Syria is constituted after the First World War, about the size of North Dakota. Okay? But it's much more complex than North Dakota in terms of its population. Okay? And Steve sort of gave us the much more interesting geographically on the Mediterranean with where the Canadian border. Best you can say. So you have this secular Ba'athist regime dominated by this, Alawi-oriented group that is not Alawist in its policy. It's a matter of their Alawi, identity, but it's not Alawist in terms of its politics. Okay, it's not pursuing a religious agenda. Just as in Iraq, you had a Sunni minority government under Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist party there, but they weren't promoting a Sunni Muslim agenda in terms of formulating educational policy or social policy or the law, etc. Both countries, branches of the Ba'athist movement were promoting a secular notion of national identity, but nonetheless, in doing that, they were very aware, both Iraq and in Syria, of the ethnic and religious divisions that were present in those countries that could be exploited, okay, and on a sort of divide and conquer sort of strategy. Okay, so that's in fact what the Alawi, Asadi government was involved in doing, playing with religious identities and the varieties of different religious community identities in Syria in order to divide them, in a sense, against themselves and in order to maintain its own control over the country, sort of the divide and conquer sort of approach. And in doing that, then, it would, sort of promote the idea that if it weren't for them, if it weren't for this secular Ba'athist Asadi regime, you'd have chaos. Okay, which threatens. What would that mean to the various religious minorities, the non-Sunni groups, especially in the country? Well, it could mean that if it weren't for us, you'd have the rise of radical Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood, and they would take over and eliminate, all of the ethnic minorities, or oppress them even worse than they already were under the Ba'athist government, etc. So they would say, you have to keep us in power. So they're appealing to people's concerns in that way, the fear of fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism. And they could point to instances, from the recent history of the country, where in the city of Hama in 1982, you had an uprising in that city led by the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood that required the Syrian army to go in under Hafiz al-Assad and just, destroy much of the city, killing thousands and thousands of people. So the government saying, look, they were threatening the national unity, the security of our different religious communities, and we had to go in and smash them. If it weren't for us, who knows what would have happened? Maybe a Khomeini-style republic would come about. So that was, one of the things that the Syrian Asadi regime was promoting. The other option would be, if not, the emergence of the Islamic Republic of Sham or Syria, you would have utter chaos. So sectarian warfare would break out, and Syria was something else that's not too cool if you're part of the country, right? You don't like the idea of open civil war, and then the fear of all kinds of outside powers coming and getting involved. Turkey from the north, right? Saudi Arabia, and from the south. Maybe Iran getting involved in some way, maybe Israel, America getting involved in some way, and really destroying, the Syrian nation. So that option was something that also the Ba'athists tried to use to maintain their power in Syria, exploiting, aware of the religious identities that are present in the country, the various Shia ones, the Sunni identities, the Druze, the Christian communities. Most of there is a sizable Christian community or group of communities in Syria, most of them following Eastern Orthodox rite. So you have the Greek Orthodox Church, and you have the Syriac Orthodox Church, you have Armenians, in Turkey, coming in Syria, as well as Catholics of various sorts and Protestants of various sorts as well. So you have, a complex spectrum of religious identity, and so, they were exploiting the concerns of members of those communities in order to maintain legitimacy and support from those minorities. And that doesn't mean they ignored the Sunnis. The Sunni majority of the country, which is put in 87%, Steve, I think it was, but it just every figure, 75%. So, yes, it varies, but a sizable Sunni majority. That doesn't mean that the Alawi government was ignoring them completely. Obviously, it was smashing ones that affiliated with religious activism. But it was also appealing to Sunni business interests in the country and giving them privileged contracts. So these would be particularly Sunni businessmen in the cities of Damascus and Halab or Aleppo. So it wasn't like they were completely keeping the Sunnis out of the picture. And Steve indicated, yes, you do have representation of Sunnis in some of the upper ranks of the army, but again, they sort of kept it arm's length. In that context. So in thinking about the Arab Spring as it occurred in the Syrian version, we have to remember some important points. One is, unlike the claims of the Ba'athist regime and some outside observers like the neocons in the United States that are trying to come back now and dictate the policy for George Romney, the uprising is not being led by Islamic fundamentalists. The opposition actually is very broad-based and it's cross-cutting. The religious sectarian divisions that the Ba'athist regime, had created and sort of manipulated in various ways were breaking down, and that's evident in terms of who's participating in these nonviolent demonstrations that have been going on in the country since March. Okay, so certainly you have a Sunni component that's very much involved, but you also have Christians that are participating in the demonstrations, or if not actively participating, sympathetic with the civilians who were victims of the bombardments that the Syrian army is conducting against urban areas such as in Homs. But you also have some of the Shia joining in the demonstrations. Ismaili Shia is the town of Salaminiya in the southwestern part of Syria is a major concentration of Ismaili Shia, and that was one of the first places where anti-government demonstrations occurred. Even Alawis have been involved in demonstrations against the government. So it's not a unified Alawi, base of support for the Assad regime. Alawis are divided into different groups among themselves, and there are those Alawis that have been marginalized by the power structure in Syria just as much as others in Syria have been marginalized. So you have had Alawi participation in the demonstration. One factor involved in the opposition groups is a kind of council called the Syrian National Council, which is sort of a government in exile, sort of in theory anyway, acting to promote the downfall of the Assad regime and to create a new entity in its place. But this Syrian National Council is composed mainly of exiles and almost completely of Sunnis. So Sunni exiles comprising the Syrian National Council, and it's suspected that they were under Saudi and Qatari influence, which means, again, outside powers may be manipulating, maybe the neocons might be manipulating these people too. They're very inexperienced with the dynamics of trying to construct, let alone operate a government, and they have prejudices against Syria's Kurdish community and the Alawi community. And observers have remarked that if you're really going to have some kind of new entity come about in Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, or in facilitating the fall of the Assad regime, you're going to have an entity that is inclusive, that is as cross-cutting and broad-based as the demonstrations are in the country of Syria. And also it has to be composed of not exiles so much as people from within Syria itself. Remember, with Iraq too, there was an effort made by the Bush regime to create an Iraqi government in exile. Some people who hadn't been to the country in decades, and that completely flopped. It took the generation of a movement within Iraq in the face of the occupation by the U.S. To come up with a new kind of political order involved that seriously was set up to try to include the different factions, and that was very much aware of the issues that had to be confronted in trying to really get an effective government going in Iraq. Iraq hasn't gotten to that point yet, but they're still working hard at getting there. So the Syrian National Council then is sort of, in terms of the spectrum of religious communities and things, is probably going to be more divisive than effective in trying to find a resolution to the uprising there, a solution to it other than one having the Assad regime remain in power. Now, among the opposition groups themselves, in addition to their representing a sort of spectrum of the different communities in Syria, you also have evidence that they are working very hard to suppress in their communities religious extremists. They're repressing the involvement of thugs and criminals. Okay, so there is a kind of self-policing that is being engaged in by the Syrian opposition. And yes, you do have, as the uprising has gone by in time, the opposition has become, more and more armed, or at least elements of the opposition have become more and more armed, and have engaged in, combat on various levels, but on a scale where the Syrian government always has the upper hand in terms of weaponry and things like that, and the armed opposition basically has to resort to smaller weapons, and weapons that can be smuggled across the border, and hidden away easily, and things like that. But in any case, when you do have the emergence of these armed groups among the opposition, they tend to follow sort of a priority where they're there to protect the demonstrations, the nonviolent demonstrations. That's sort of one of their first priorities. And when they engage in action, there's an effort made not to make civilians the victims of their action. Okay, so even there, where you have an armed opposition, it's for the time being, as we can see from a large part of the evidence, the non-violent priorities of the Syrian opposition remain sort of an underlying principle by which they're acting. So that violence is part of it, but nonetheless, there still seems to be a set of ideals that they're trying to adhere to. Now the government will say, when our troops entered a mosque in one of the urban centers of resistance, we found weapons stored there. Or they'll say, in Hama or Homs, we uncovered a group that's trying to create a caliphate in Homs. So they're trying to still invoke that religious fundamentalist and Islamic Republic kind of fear language, but nobody's buying it. Okay, except for the neocons in the Western media, New York Times and Israel. That this is really an Islamist insurgency rather than a broad-based, inter-religious, inter-ethnic opposition movement. Thinking sort of down the line, long term, that I think religious identities among these various communities will continue to be a factor in the evolution of a new political order. It's not like the religious identities are going to be done away with. There needs to be one, but I think it will be just one aspect, religious identity, one aspect of an emerging new civil society in in Syria. In fact, I'm rather optimistic, even though there's bound to be more loss of life, and there's already been over 10,000 Syrians have died in just a little bit over a year since this uprising began. I tend to look at the outcome optimistically, and if anybody's seen the movie The Marigold Hotel, great movie, Kevin, it's just played a great line in there, where the Indian character says, everything will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, then it's not the end.